now be recorded.
So, Bapi, are you planning to stay? Okay, I don't know. So, I think for first of all, I want to thanks again Mudassar, Anu, and Javi for the excellent work you guys have done, and I think the demonstration you did today. Because last time when we had a discussion in this business work group 2 weeks ago, there were I think 12 people or something, and at least today there were 27 or 28. So that was a good visibility, I think, and we got more inputs to the model. One other thing which I want to talk today is so we have two agenda. One, Roberto will walk through his model for known good die and get some input because that OCP paper uh, he has submitted. It's coming due soon. And Roberto, I'm assuming that your paper was not ejected out. Can you
Yeah,
confirm?
I have to. I don't think it was rejected out. I just don't know how to confirm. I guess I need to log on to the website.
You should have received an email actually.
Okay. All right. Let me check. I think Bapi. I don't know if Bapi's on the call,
Hey,
but I think
hey,
Bapi confirmed.
hey, Roberto, I can confirm that your paper is in. I think it's session 1885, which is confirmed. Yes. So you will be presenting as a part of a tech talk. So there are two sections, right? There's a ecosystem lightning talk and there's a technology talk. So you have 10 minutes known good die presentation in the technology portion of ODSA. So you're on.
Okay. Thank you for confirming.
So that's awesome. And now I know I think Kevin and Rishi just joined. So there was a uh, panel which was submitted around interfaces, and I think I got a email yesterday. I think that got rejected. But DJ, you can you confirm?
Yeah. So here is what I think we have decided, just as an FYI to everyone. Bapi covered it already. We try to accept everything possible, and there was way too many content. So the way we kind of worked around the time issue, because the time is finite, we can't give time to everyone and keep the time block for OCP. So we have two panels. One is an opening panel and one is a closing panel. Opening panel is all about workstream update. So that covers everything which people are trying to present as a workstream update. And then the closing panel is actually, we have called it ODSA 2022. And that will have representatives from each of the panels submitted, right? There are multiple panels submitted. So we will try to weave in themes from all the panels into essentially talking about the roadmap for 2022 for ODSA. And that includes interface panel discussion as well. So all of that will be included. The downside of this approach is that obviously, you cannot have panel with 10 people or, it probably is max 5 people, one moderator and 4, or one moderator and 5 people, 5 panelists. So we will have to find a way to cover all the topics in the closing panel, while making sure that panelists are well equipped to represent the specific content of the broader panel which was submitted. So hopefully that makes sense as I explained.
So Dharmesh, from that point of view, at this point, Kevin and Rishi doesn't need to work on the panel they were thinking. I think that's
Correct,
much.
100%. Yeah, but Kevin and Rishi will somehow get incorporated in the closing panel. And we will probably ask each of the panel organizers to kind of give a content, or like, what is it that you want to talk about, and we will frame the question accordingly. So these panels are curated, right? These are not live random panels. So you can come and say, this is what I want to talk about, this is what I would like community to know about, and then based on those discussions, the questions will get curated, and then each panelist will answer to basically cover whatever they wanted to share to begin with the community. Does that make sense? Rishi, Kevin, you understand what we are trying to do?
Yeah, that's fine with us. It is fine with me. Kevin, if you want to speak up.
Yeah, I'm good with that.
Yeah, and again, this is purely because of the function of trying to get everyone into the track while maintaining the limit of 200 minutes, 4 hours, half a day. So that's how we kind of compromise.
We are good with it. Yeah.
Thanks, Dharmesh. So now moving on. So Roberto, do you want to share your update?
Yep. Let me share my screen. Uh-oh, why is my share my screen grayed out?
I think Ravi, you'll have to delegate screen sharing to.
Oh, 1 second.
Okay.
Okay, now you're presenter.
Oh, there you
Roberto, can you try now?
Yeah, it's giving me the option. Let me just.
While Roberto is bringing up his, I would like to ask, is there anyone new to this business work stream? And if so, do you would like to do a small introduction? I see some new names actually. And again, if you don't want to, that's okay, but I think it will be a good idea. All right, go ahead, Roberto.
Yep. So what I wanted to do, I know everyone's got precious time. So what I wanted to do was maybe 3 things in this meeting. One, just take you through kind of the agenda, just so everyone's kind of familiar with the way I'm thinking about the agenda, get some feedback there. Then there's some specific help needed. So, maybe kind of a call out to the community on the call. If they could, we can kind of get some mind share around where I need some help, and it's pretty clear. And then what I'd like to do is take you through kind of 2 business models in when looking at an open chiplet environment, right? One is from the chiplet provider, and then the other business model from the SIP builder, right? So the chiplet based SIP builder. And I think and you'll see quickly, there's some parameters in the business model that we vary to see the sensitivity, in particular around known good die, and then varying the sensitivity on known good die between the view from the chiplet provider and then the SIP builder. You can zero in, and depending on the use cases, this is why it's important to kind of, if we can agree on a couple of chiplet use cases, you can kind of zero in on where we think the known good die metric will land. I mean, there's a value we need to associate with it, and then I think that'll feed forward kind of what an agreement might look like under those scenarios. So starting with the agenda, right? I think some of you have seen the slide. There's a slide that I'll work on. It's just really describing the manufacturing and test steps, differences between a monolithic chip and a chiplet-based SIP. And I think that'll just visually, it'll get people to understand that there are differences there, and then scrap cost is thought of a little bit differently, and then who should own scrap cost kind of gets teased out of that. Then I want to focus the presentation a little bit on the sensitivity of KGD to the business model for various type of chiplet providers, and then kind of go through the same business model from the chiplet builder point of view. And that's what I'll take you guys through some of those models after the agenda and the help needed. Then, like I said, I'll go through some agreements based on some use cases, and that's really where I need some help, is just what we think might be reasonable use cases. And by the way, it might make sense to go through the models first and then circle back on what use cases we might want to go with, because it'll, depending on the use case, it could highlight some sensitivities to KGD in the business models. And then I think really what we want to round off is because the manufacturing and test steps are different, KGD gets looked at differently. But there's also another set of challenges, and this is maybe where my expertise and my company's expertise really comes in, is, what you'll quickly realize is you'll want a better known good die coming out of a chiplet test and manufacturing test, workflow versus a monolithic. However, there are some headwinds in terms of being able to get quality coverage. And I think there's a lot of experts on this call, and I think what I'd like to do is kind of synthesize what those headwinds are, some of the challenges of really testing to quality in a chiplet environment, and then kind of proposing some possible solutions that either exist or that are underway, or some hypotheticals on how we could really test at the chiplet level that's maybe different than the way people are thinking about it today to get to a really known good die. So that's the approach in those 10 minutes that I have. I'd like to maybe pause and see if anyone has feedback on kind of the agenda. Okay, well,
So Roberto, I can comment on that. I was just waiting if somebody will say something. So on help needed, where you have use cases, maybe we can use what Mudassar, Anu, and Javi shared in terms of use cases. So they have one use case where you have one big monolithic die and then 16 chiplet around it, and then in another case the monolithic die was also break down into 2 chiplet and then 16 chiplet around it. Or if you think that will be too much for this.
Yeah, let's see. I think.
Or you want to keep it more simple, or you want to keep it more simple.
No. What I'd want to do is do the extremes. I think business models are interesting. You got to test them at the extreme. So one is where there's a lot of chiplets. What you'll see quickly is the business model gets pretty tricky around known good die if you're the builder. And then the other extreme is, so I think I'd like to test it at the extremes where there's few chiplets, a lot of chiplets, and then something right in the middle. And what I'd also like to do is why I want to bring it up. I don't just want to, and I like the way you're thinking about it, Ravi, is if we can have some commonality within the conference of what people are using for use cases. So everyone's really taking these chiplet use cases and applying it different ways. Versus me just creating my own, right?
No, so if you think your model can take it, what Mudassar and team use as use cases, I think they have done a lot of work on that. So I think that could be a good, and your base case could be just your big monolithic die, where you can compare what if it was just a monolithic die versus the 2 cases where they have one monolithic die and 16 chiplet, and then 2 dies and 16 chiplet.
Okay. Yeah, I think that's really good. So what I'll do is I'll reach out to that team, right, to Anu, Javier, and Mudassar, and just maybe get some more information, and I'll feed that back into my model. I think that's helpful. And if anyone else has some ideas on common use cases that people are looking at, let's see, I might only present 2 to 3 of them, but maybe behind the scenes I can look, we can look at a bunch of them and then determine which ones we present. So I'm open to multiple suggestions too.
So Roberto, I do have a suggestion, and I think it would make sense to use this use case. So the suggestion is as follows. There's already an existing use case being pursued in ODSA. It's called Object Store Accelerator with ODSA POC. This is being pursued with JP driving some of the work. Not only that, they are also presenting this at the OCP Summit in the opening talk, right? It's going to be part of the opening panel. So the reason of including this in your use case would be ideal because it's already being discussed at the summit. You can refer to that in your talk, saying that as we heard in the morning panel from JP about the object store accelerator, that's the use case we are talking about. And I'm sure that team will be very happy to work with you because they are trying to build that use case, and the more information they can generate, including how the known good die would work, they would be very happy to cross-reference the work which you're doing. So I would strongly encourage that. In fact, we were planning to have a workshop on that particular use case as a starting point. But then because of the time and all, we have not been able to organize it. So you will already get a lot of support within ODSA for getting data on that use case, or at least discussions. So that would be my suggestion.
Yeah, that's a really good suggestion. How do I follow up with that?
So here are two ways to follow it up. You can reach out to JP. I don't know if JP is on the call here. JP is an awesome guy and he'll jump on it right away. I can make the connection, or you can also talk about in the next Friday meeting. I would suggest in the open meeting, take 5 minutes to say, hey, we are doing this and we would love to talk with Object Store Accelerator folks. So please reach out to me offline, and then I'm sure people will get to know you and then they will reach out. So do a shout out next Friday in the general meeting for like 2 minutes, and then immediately you'll get people reaching out to you. And I'll also try to connect you with JP via email.
Yeah, if you can do that, Dharmesh, just because maybe I want to circle with him early next week, just so I could start understanding the use case.
Yeah, consider it done, Roberto.
Perfect. Thank you. Thank you.
Hey, Roberto, this is Swami. If I may ask you a question, I don't know if it is, directly relevant to this particular agenda. One of the key outcomes that I would be interested in as a user or, user of test systems is any implications between the tester type, the tester cost, between, a monolithic die testing and a chiplet die testing. Is it going to change the configurations, and is it going to increase the number of cards, which is going to directly impact the cost of test? Is this a relevant point?
Yeah, it's actually a very relevant point in maybe you cited, will this, to get to the known good die, because there are different challenges, is it going to change kind of the tester configuration or the tester cost? I'll certainly be examining that. But the most obvious one that I think people have been talking about and what we see with our customers, it's really driving another insertion around SLT. So system level test has always been, so what's going to happen is now that you're breaking up kind of all of the IP used to just reside in really one chip, and then you can test the interdependencies of that chip, even at the wafer sort level. But now that you're breaking up the functionality into different chiplets and it all kind of comes together in the SIP, there's going to be some interactions between the different IP blocks that weren't really tested at wafer. And so what you'll end up seeing is some more activity with system level test, which is a different type of tester.
Yes, understood. I think SLT is already a part. I think the model as presented by Mudasir and was, it takes that into consideration. That is the trend that we've seen, Roberto, of course, working with Teradyne is, with every generation of AP, the cost of tester is going up. So that would be an interesting, that's what triggered that thought process is, we see that scaling up in cost, the power requirements and, the instrumentation, the cards. If you go to chiplets, would there be a disintegration and, it could reduce the cost of the tester and hence the unit cost at test? That was my thought process.
Yeah. So I'll talk a little bit about that, and I'd be good if once I fully flush it out, maybe to review it with you in advance, if that's okay. But
perfectly fine. I'm very interested in lowering the cost.
Yeah, I know.
Actually, guys, this is Rishi here. I have another dumb question maybe on this side. So When we talk about this known good die, especially for the chiplets, right, there is one aspect of it is a standalone die by itself, which is a known good die, and then when you integrate it. Unlike the normal monolithic die, where the connectivity is kind of standardized, because there is a CIE spec for the interconnects, which is part of the IEEE, and we all know it. So when we do the testing, we have a fixed defined parameters for the IO, and when we test the die. Whereas in case of chiplets, there is a dependency on the package technology and also the way the chiplet has been architected, whether it's a organic substrate, whether it's an interposer based. And if it's an interposer based, yes, there is something coming from JDEC, there is some baseline. How do we tackle this known good die from a testability point of view when there is dependency on the package side of things, especially if it's an organic substrate? And within the foundry also, there are different variants of classes of coax depending upon the class of integration. How do we factor that? And trust me, I'm not a testing expert by any means. This is just a general question which has come into my mind.
Yeah. I mean, the talk is really focused on. Yeah, I'll have to reflect on that one, Rishi.
Okay, just a curiosity from my side that how does it get tested? Because as I said, I'm not expecting an answer, maybe because this is a new territory, but looking from a system side, I had to throw this in because I myself don't have any clues about it as to how it works.
Okay.
Yeah, Rishi, you do bring up a good point, and I think that ties back into that pretty good die terminology that Anu had mentioned earlier.
Yeah.
And you can't test everything, particularly when you get to these micro bumps, right? You can't touch all the pads, if the pitch is too small. So you just got to get it tested to the point where it's good enough to make it to the next step, but not known good. And you'll inherently have less coverage with a 2.5D like approach than you would with a 2.1D, because 2.1D you can touch everything. So yeah, good point. We should in these analyses keep that point in mind.
Yeah.
But Javier, that's the crux of the business problem. So I think, if we could continue debating, I'm happy to debate, but I also want to spend some time taking you through the business model. And I know Anu and some of you have seen it already. I don't know, Javier, if you looked at it, but I think what you're going to see is the business model is very sensitive to how good that die is as you hand it off to the SIP builder. And there's going to be tremendous amount of sensitivity, and it depends on what die you're providing and what your margins are. We'll get into it. And I think my thesis that might come out of it is, oh man, we really need to spend a lot of time and thought on figuring out how to get a really good solid chiplet. But I'd like for you guys to look at the model, and maybe I'm thinking about it in the wrong way, but I'd certainly like to get some feedback. And then maybe circling back to Swami, you're saying how the tester might change. One of, something that we're seeing as we talk to our customers, because these die-to-die interfaces, which haven't really been fully flushed out, there's not a lot of diode protection circuitry on them. And they also, because they're very short distance, they don't have the signal strength to really drive off chip, meaning they won't be able to drive into a tester and the tester able to kind of make measurements or kind of read back registers, because they won't have the signal strength to drive through the probe needles, through the MLO, through the probe card into the instrument. And so what we're seeing is some companies are putting test pins on these chiplets that are able to, like, think of GPIO, but instead of low speed, think of very high speed, because now you want to use 3 to 4 pins, right? So you don't want to put a lot of pins because real estate's expensive. And you want to drive those pins at incredible bandwidths because you want to get scan data in and off the device. And so kind of a hypothesis is these configs might shift to more high-speed serial type instruments versus these low speed, ton of digital channel instruments.
Thanks, Roberto. Yeah, that trend is already in place, as I mentioned. It's driving the cost of those north. So that would be a good, at least for me, being selfish here, to look at the implications of that, because how it's going to impact my capex. So thanks, Roberto. I think that's an important problem statement, at least from my perspective.
Roberto, so quick question: is that sort of akin to the sacrificial bumps that they talk about in HBM? So, one interesting topic might be, how does HBM do it? Now, I understand that stacking DRAM on is very different from logic chips, right? The way you test DRAM, and if they all function as memory identically, then it's very different. There is recovery mechanisms by putting in redundancy. But what does HBM do today, and what are those yields? What do those numbers look like? And they do use this concept of sacrificial bumps, I believe, in testing. So is that something we could sort of borrow from or compare to? Roberto, you're on mute if you're talking. Not sure.
I was talking. Yeah, I let's see. Yeah, it's what I'm talking about. I mean, we've got a lot of customers, and that's, one of our big customers is really heading down that path, right? Using these sacrificial pins to test DRAM. Yeah. Yeah, this is, so just to get back to your question, Anu, what's the thought there? I mean, it'll certainly come into the test challenges and how to address some of those. Like I said, I think there's some industry best practices, so I'd like to just summarize those. And then there's just stuff that the industry haven't really figured out how to do yet, or they're working on it and there's a certain type of approach. I'd like to summarize that as well. And so I think what you just described is really under what the industry has been doing in order to address these type of chips, right? Testing DRAM. There's DDR, but there's HBM, but they're putting these sacrificial pins, exactly what you described. Yeah.
Yeah, and what are they doing, and what have they achieved at the end of it? And we agree there's a difference between testing just memory versus logic chips, but sort of leverage off of that and say what works and what we can take from there and what we can't.
Yep.
Thanks.
Okay. Let's jump to, and I think some of you have seen this. I updated it since then. It's not as sophisticated as the last model that you were looking at, but the intent is to really show the sensitivity with KGD. I don't know how, my laptop's a 13-inch monitor right now, so I don't know how big or how small this is. So I've got two models. The one on the left is the chiplet provider point of view, and so I want to start with that one. And then the one on the right is the SIP builder point of view. And just to give you kind of an example, like what we know a lot about is the monolithic complex SoC devices. And so when they come out of wafer sort, and perhaps a lot of you are in this business at the OSAT and the package side, so you can confirm or deny, and if you deny, we should maybe tighten the range. But wafer sort yield for these monolithic devices, so when things come out of wafer sort, are really between, you get what they call, you get a 70% yield. The yield's terrible, but once those devices pass wafer sort, you do another round of testing, you generally see it between 95 and 99.5%. So the known good die that's coming out of wafer sort is between 95 and 99.5%. So when you go to final test, you get anywhere between 5% to 0.5% falling out. And I think that's a good number to have in your back of your mind as we go through some of these examples. So what I did here was I just used one use case, right? it's a chiplet that I made up, and I'd like to obviously align with some more common use cases, but it's got 4 chips to it. It's got a wireless LAN, a GPU, a CPU core, and an AI core. And ignore what they are. I think what's important here is what's the ASP. So if you're the chiplet provider, that means your selling price to the SIP builder, and then this is your chiplet cost. And any of these you can kind of adjust and monitor. And then here you've got your margin, and here you've got your chiplet margin percent. And then there's something called actual yield, but ignore that for now. I'll go back to actual yield because that's what these tables become. There's really this what I call the negotiated yield. So what this is these chiplet providers have negotiated a yield to the builder, and the negotiation is simple, right? I guarantee that 98% of my chips that I hand to you, my chiplet that I hand to you, builder, is going to work, and 2% is not going to work, and they've agreed that that's okay. I'm going to basically do a sensitivity analysis on this, and what that means is if it's 98% and above, the chiplet provider, so these people here, don't have to pay for scrap costs. There's no penalty in the contract. If it's below, you pay for the scrap cost. And that's important because your scrap cost from the builder's perspective is what they're really paying. So this becomes kind of what they're responsible with. And then if you just add up kind of all of the chiplet ASP, it's $20. So your scrap cost is $20. So you're selling a $2 chip, and if it's 98% and above, you're golden. If it's below 98%, you start paying scrap cost. And so it can get very, very expensive if it's significantly below 98%. And that's what these are sensitivity analysis. We'll go through it. And that's for these 4 different chiplets. So when I look at the wireless LAN, so this is the business model of, it's an open environment. So this is one chiplet provider. It's another company. And so what I put here is this is the actual yield. This is the negotiated yield. So this is an excursion. So I'm schmooing it, right? So I'm varying the actual yield away from the negotiated yield. And then this right here is their margins. So in this case, I said, if their margins are 50% and I deviate from my negotiated yield, right? So now you're paying the scrap cost. How are my margins going to get impacted? And I just used if my margins are 50 or 90%, what it looks like. And so remember, the wireless LAN is the smallest of the chiplet providers in terms of value. And what you see here is if you hit 98% and you're at 50% margins, you're making 50% margins because there's no penalty. If you deviate half a point, you lose 5% margins. And that's really, it's a linear equation, so it's pretty consistent. So every half a point, you lose 5% margins. So if you have a yield excursion that goes by 6%, let's say, so that puts you at 92.5, right? So 5.5%. You're actually losing money. You're losing money on every chip that you ship. So what that means is, you're obviously very incredibly sensitive to any excursion from your negotiated yield. So if you're a chiplet provider and you're the $2 chiplet in a $20 SIP, you have to really, really, really make sure, do as much thorough testing as possible to hit this 98%. And so, the negotiation is really, well, what should this number really be? And so to figure out what this number should really be, we have to look at the SIP builder's point of view, because if, he's biased, as we'll see in his business model, to have a high percentage point, have a high yield here, because the lower this is, the more he eats the scrap cost, or she eats the scrap cost, right? The builder. So what I did here is I did the same sensitivity analysis with the GPU, the CPU, and the AI core. And so I know I'm doing a lot of talking, and I'll pause just quickly. Just if you look at the business model from the GPU maker, which is the more expensive chip, the sensitivity is very different as that company has an excursion from their negotiated yield. So this case was 5%. This case is really 1%. So if they go 0.5% in yield, they lose 1% margin. I'm going to pause before I go any further. Any questions, thoughts, concerns? Is it all just obvious?
So, Roberto, this is Ravi. There's a lot of information. So I don't know if people can even digest that many, at least not me. I have some basic questions. So when you say WLAN versus GPU and so from a system level or from a SIP level, if yield deviate for smaller chip versus a GPU, you're saying 5% versus 1% delta. Is it because in the end you end up in throwing the SIP because of the smaller chip? That's why this delta is being adjusted, or maybe I'm just trying to understand why the yield difference of zero point 0.5 is making a 5% difference in WLAN versus GPU only 1%.
Yeah, so yeah, and I can share this spreadsheet, I can email it and you can see the equations, but at the high level, all these chiplet providers are ultimately responsible for the scrap cost. And the scrap cost is $20. So
Okay.
for every
No,
chip,
I think you answered my question. So it is
okay.
because of the scrap cost of the SIP.
Yep.
That's why WLAN is being penalized more than the GPU, because the contribution of WLAN, though it's a cheaper chip, but now you end up in wasting the bigger SIP.
Correct. Yep. Yep. You
Okay.
got it.
Yeah, so I'd say that the takeaway, please correct me if I've interpreted this wrong, but the takeaway on this is if you're going to engage in this chiplet business with a negotiated yield, then you'll need to have the additional margin just to cover the overall scrap cost. So the WLAN is the only one that doesn't have a very large margin compared to the others. It's kind of small in comparison, and that's the one that goes negative. So just the takeaway is you just need to have extra margin that you're going to engage in that kind of business.
Yeah.
Along those lines, I have one more question, Javi, and both for Roberto. Is it a typical business model where scrap cost is beared by all the chiplet provider, or is it a hypothetical business model we are proposing here?
That's a great question, and I wanted to open it up to some of the folks on the call. So let's see. In my experience, right, when you look at, if you use what the closest thing to a chiplet-based SIP is maybe a PCB, right, where the PCB is aggregating a bunch of monolithic silicon. And so if you look at companies like Apple, who make phones, right, just as an example, a lot of these contracts are set up where you're liable for the scrap cost. I mean, it's a negotiated contract. So the expectation is you're going to deliver a certain quality, and if you deliver that quality, everything is good. But if your quality starts to suffer and there's an excursion, why would the builder then be responsible for throwing away all those phones? The example that I'm using. So
Roberto, maybe you again. I know this is a working meeting, but when say you go into the OCP, maybe you should put that as a assumption that this is the business model you have in mind, and this is how, because this is very important for people to understand, especially this chiplet will drive a lot of smaller chiplet like IO chiplet. And now,
correct.
if I am an IO chiplet company, and if I am in the end responsible for overall chiplet based SIP scrap cost, it may not be an attractive business for me.
Well, yeah, correct. Or there's two ways to look at it. It's not an attractive because I can't really guarantee the yield that's been negotiated, or I have a really good design and my manufacturing process is dialed in because I'm on a dated node because it's more of a commodity IP, and I know I can hit that negotiated yield day in, day out. Like
Okay.
I think there has to be, it's really around confidence around the
Yeah,
KGD
yeah,
agreement.
yeah, you're right. But I think you should put that as an assumption, and then maybe just make people aware of that you are using PCB as a, you know, business model in mind. And to me, that's, unless people have another suggestion, to me that's a very reasonable assumption here.
Yeah, I think to Ravi's point, we do need to specify that, Roberto, because while in some situations, in many situations, there is an agreement where the scrap cost is borne by the component vendor. There are two caveats to those, right? One is, you know, in my past life, I have been in situations where, because the scrap cost is being held accountable by to the component vendor, you will have a component vendor who will say to you, look, even if you tell me the sky is blue, I'll disagree with you. This is not my component's fault because I don't want to eat that cost. And the second part is that if you take the PCB example, imagine if you're like a tiny screw provider and the screw is used on a small part on the PCB. The cost of the PCB may be in the tens of thousands of dollars. If you were to ask that screw provider to be responsible for the scrap cost of the whole PCB, they will just go out of business. So what happens is that there is a minimum threshold below which the vendor of the device is no longer responsible for the scrap cost of the entire PCB. They may eat up a small part of it, but you know, going with the PCB model, you know, a 0.02 cent capacitor can bring down an entire board. But you can't expect that capacitor vendor to eat up the cost of the whole board because it'll just kill them. Even if that capacitor is a known, established, older node and all that, you know, capacitor is a very mature technology. So there are nuances to the negotiation where there's a minimum threshold of pricing in business that you may not be able to hold that vendor accountable for the scrap cost of the entire device. And I think articulating that in the beginning, Roberto, will make your presentation more powerful because then they will spend less time questioning that assumption.
But Roberto, one thing I can tell you, you are moving in a right direction. This is very, very valuable for the community to look at it, you know, chiplet at this level of detail, you know, what it takes to do this.
Right. And I think you know the pricing part of it will really help people understand the relationship between pricing and yield sensitivity. And you're trying to guide them towards the fact that they need to negotiate that yield part up front so that there are no surprises during, you know, production.
Yeah, and by the way, this is also, I mean, this is it's I'm going to complicate it, but it'll come out in the presentation at some point, and I'd like to obviously have some dry runs. Is you're going to be incentivized to figure out how to repair, right? Because there's two ways to think about it. If you're a wireless LAN, I'm going to use a terrible example, but bear with me. You know, you're a wireless LAN chiplet provider, and your scrap cost is $20, and you know something fails inside of inside of the device that's on it's part of your RF chain. You know, maybe you have redundancy, so it fails, and instead of eating the $18 of scrap cost, you designed inside of that chip another RF path that you could program at the SIP level, and all of a sudden, you know, the builder sends you the chip, you repair it, you send it back, and you know you've been able to repair it versus spend the $18. So, and it's not an uncommon thought, right? There's a lot of these discussions on having, and I know a lot of people have opinions, but I think what this might also do is bias some of these chiplet providers to have some redundancy, if possible, in their design to hedge against these potential losses.
Makes sense. Makes sense.
Okay. Now, so, you know, the question, if you're a chiplet provider, you're like, well, I'm just going to negotiate a 90% yield, right? Why am I going to take the risk? So let's look at the builder's point of view, because someone has to pay scrap cost. So I'm just trying to get the cells to line up here. Give me a second. Okay. So this model is so let's see. Okay, let's go through it. So you're the builder. I'll go through the lines, and I'm sure I won't do a good job of explaining it. But you've got, here's your negotiated chiplet yield, right? So 98%. I just wanted to mirror the other example. There's going to be sensitivity to the number of chiplets in the SIP, because now, now you, in this example, you've got 8 chiplets. And by the way, I do a sensitivity on the number of chiplets. That's why it matters. And if you've got 98%, if you're the builder, you're responsible for the 2% of the stuff that fails. So, the more chips you have, and if each chip fails at a 2% rate, your failure rate in this example, it's just probability, right? It becomes pretty high. So then you incur the scrap cost, and that's going to cost you money. And so here's your cost of your SIP. This is what you're selling it at. You can obviously change it. So this is your margin. If you have no scrap cost, and then this is if your margin you have scrap cost. Okay, and so this is your impact to your margin as you're kind of eating the scrap cost. So I'll go to the table and I can circle back. So here's your known good die agreement. Maybe if you're a really powerful SIP builder, you have 100% agreement. If you're less powerful, it kind of works its way down. And then these are just the number of chiplets. And so inside of these cells is really just your margin impact to what it would have been if there's no scrap cost. So an example is if you've got, let's look at the 100%. So you've negotiated an ironclad contract where known good die is 100%, someone else carries the burden of the scrap cost. So you have no impact to your margin. It's, you're regardless of how many chips. If your known good die is now 99.5%, so now anything that fails above 99.5, you're gonna throw it away and it'll be part of your scrap cost. And then this becomes your margin excursion. So, pretty minimal, but if you have a lot of chiplets, it starts to increase. And I'm not going to torture you with going row by row, but as you work your way down to known good die and you increase the number of chiplets, you can have a significant impact on your business. And so really, if you're the builder, you're going to want to go as high as possible, but realistically, no one's going to provide you chiplets because there's a lot of risk if you're the chiplet provider. So, you're going to float somewhere in between here. And if you're the chiplet builder, if you're the SIP builder, the more chiplets you have, the more you're really going to want to force the conversation to the higher known good die. So this is the tug of war, right? There's going to be a natural tug of war from the business models. And I think what I wanted to highlight here is a little bit of what the tug of war means to both sides of the business and how the business model is sensitive to KGD on both sides of the house, but the number of chiplets is another axis if you're the builder of which you're very sensitive to, because the probability of it failing the more chips you have increases. Comments, questions, concerns?
So Roberto, this number in the example that you've taken, the 98% yield from chiplets, you've integrated 8 into the SIP. This total SIP yield now, 85.1%, takes into account KGD plus just the integration yield, right? I mean, integrating 8 chiplets itself has.
No,
Oh,
it does not.
Okay.
Yeah. No, there you go. That's why it's good to review model. It gets worse. Correct.
Yeah, I was going to say. I mean, I was wondering if this took into account both.
No, it did not. How do I get a good proxy for that? I think you and your team have modeled that, correct? Like, have you put a bogey for integration yield as the number of chiplets increase?
Right. The way Mudassar has it is he basically has the number of assembly steps, and with each assembly step has a certain yield. And so as you add more, there is an impact on the yield. So, there's two pieces. One is the yield of the incoming chiplet, and then second is the yield of actual integration of those steps. And Mudassir can elaborate more if he'd like to.
No, I know you captured it. That's exactly right.
That's a great point. Okay. So actually, how do I get my hands on that model? And I think I might have failed on an action item 2 weeks ago, was to send maybe it was Bapi or Ravi an email on who wanted to get access to the model, and I didn't send my email address. So maybe Mudassir, I'll send you my email address. If you could send me a link to the model, that'd be helpful.
Sure. It'll be helpful, Roberto, as we discussed in the past, if we can, we can review yours as well, because again, we can help contribute to yours, and there are some synergies and advantages. But we can definitely send you our model.
So may I suggest something? We are almost out of time. Should few of us meet offline between maybe Roberto, Mudassir, Anu, and Javi, and I can facilitate maybe sometime next week just to look at some of the commonality between the model, and maybe we both can leverage each other's model.
Yep.
Sure. So Ravi, Anu, myself, and Javi have a standing weekly meeting where we
also
meet.
Wednesday 3 p.m. right?
Right.
Yeah, that's right.
So maybe Roberto, if that you can join Pacific 3 p.m. Wednesday, is that something works for your schedule next week?
Yeah, that'll work.
I'll forward it to Roberto. And actually, I think for the coming Wednesday meeting, I also invited you, Ravi, and Kevin.
That's fine. I think Kevin can be there. That's
Okay.
perfectly fine.
I'll forward it right now.
Okay. Perfect. Yeah, we could spend more time going through it and getting them aligned. Okay. I know we got 6 minutes left. Ravi, I don't have anything else to share. I'm okay taking, I'm more than happy to take more comments and questions.
Okay. I don't have any specific feedback. This is great, by the way, great progress, but I'll let others, otherwise we'll give 5 minutes back to the team.
This is very good, guys. Very informative.
Okay.
I appreciate everyone's time and feedback. Thank you. Helpful.
Thanks, everyone.
Thanks. Bye.
Thanks.
Thank you.